Remember that we are looking at the 11th chapter of Daniel because it gives us a better understanding of what's going on between the testaments. We've looked at the second verse a couple of weeks ago. Tonight our topic will be the third verse, and then, if God wills, next week the fourth verse. And all of that really is what we've covered before in studies in the intertestamental period, because it's a review of the Persian and the Greek kings. And then starting with the next verse, which would be the fifth verse, that will begin really what we can call new material. So we're in Daniel 11 and verse 3. It talks about a mighty king, Melech Gibor, that will stand up and rule with great dominion and do according to his will, which I think is the essence of what the third verse says. Daniel 11 gives us the king and then gives us a twofold description of him, which in the Hebrew, now we're just going to take this first phrase. I think the verse really is broken down into three sections. The subject of the verse is the mighty king, the Melech Gibor, and then it gives a twofold description of him, which in the Hebrew, Daniel 11:3, and we'll start dealing just with this first part of the verse, Ve'amad Melech Gibor. And it goes on, mashal, meshal, rav ve'hasa, kiretsono. That's all the Hebrew has. You notice it's a short verse compared to all that we had to deal with there in the second verse and all that we'll have to look at down there in the fourth verse. So we're just looking to begin with at the initial phrase, Ve'amad Melech Gibor, and a mighty king shall stand up. Or to give you the order of the Hebrew, and stand up, king mighty. And stand up, king mighty. Ve'amad Melech Gibor. And stand up, that is just and. In Hebrew it's always attached as a prefix. Ve'amad, stand up, that's that military term that we said occurs many times here in the 11th chapter. We already saw that back in verse 2. There shall stand up yet three kings. And it's the same term again, verse 3, which is what we're on, Ve'amad. And then it's down in verse 4 as well, Amad. Then King Melech Gibor shall stand up. Now, since the subject of the preceding verse, which is the second verse, the subject of the preceding verse had been the 3 plus 1 equals 4 kings. Remember that? I know it's been a couple of weeks since we've been here, but the 3 plus 1 equals 4 kings of Persia. Then one might naturally, but in this case falsely, assume that this too is a Persian leader that is referred to here in the third verse, because nothing is stated otherwise. The term Greece or Grecia is mentioned, Yavan in the Hebrew is mentioned in the end of verse 2, but that's only as the opponent of those who've been stirred up back in verse 2, which would be those under these Persian kings. The 3 plus 1 equals 4, particularly the fourth one, which is Xerxes. But this description in verse 4, the description, verse 3 as well, of this mighty king. That's our topic this evening, the mighty king. Who's the mighty king? The description in verse 3 and verse 4 dispels any idea that this might just be another Persian leader, and therefore verse 3 would chronologically and therefore immediately be connected with verse 2. You see, what I'm saying is, as you read along, unless you knew something else, unless you go on into 3 and 4, and see the description of this king, you could easily assume that since Persia is the topic, and Persian kings, then so it would be in verse 3 as well, and verse 4 as well, which is not the case. Because even the critics will admit that the mighty king is Alexander the Great, and the description of the mighty king fits him to a T and no one else. So even the critics will admit that. This is just one of those hundreds of examples in sections of biblical prophecy where you find a chronological break. Just because you find a chronological break, however, doesn't mean that the text is misleading, but we'll say something about that in a moment. So we have a twofold change from verse 2 down to verse 3. We have a twofold change. Behold, there shall stand up yet 3 kings in Persia, and the fourth shall be far richer than they all, Cambyses through Darius, and then fourthly Xerxes. And by his strength, through his riches, he shall stir up all against the realm of Yavan, Grecia. And a mighty king shall stand up. You see, you would just take him automatically to be another king of Persia, as you would read along. And he'll stand up and rule with great dominion and do according to his will. But there's a break between verses 2 and 3. There's a break. 144 years are skipped in history. 144 years are skipped in history between 2 and 3, the verses of Daniel 11. We go from 480 down to 336 BC. And then secondly, as I've already intimated, there's a change of nationality from the Persians to the Greeks. So the question is raised, can something like this really be allowed in Scripture? I mean, is there not a small measure of deception present when Alexander is presented, or this mighty king, whom we know to be from his description, Alexander to be Alexander? Is there not some small measure of deception whenever Alexander is just presented as though he is right in succession with the other Persian kings? In other words, the uninitiated in Old Testament and intertestamental history might be led into deception, as he read along here in Daniel 11, 2 and 3, because he doesn't think in his mind, watch out, by the time you get to the end of verse 2, you're going to skip 1.5 centuries, so be prepared for that. And in addition, we're going to be skipping over talking about a different nationality. Isn't that somehow misleading or deceptive? No, it's not, for the following reasons. You see, Greece is the last word in the Hebrew text as well as the English text in Daniel 11:2, which leads neatly right into talking about leaders of Greece. Now, that's not all we can say, because that's not enough said. But that is the last word. In other words, your attention now is on Greece. As soon as you complete the verse, your attention is on Greece. And although we might assume in reading verses 3 and 4, and we see these Persian kings, and it's going to stay Persian kings by the time we get down here to verse 3, we might assume that, but there's nothing in the text that tells us that. There's nothing in the text that even implies that. You see, the Bible takes for granted that you have to have some other knowledge. In no way is this deception, like the critics would say. They don't like it if you can find a large chronological gap between verses, because they say, well, see, the Bible's misleading. It's tricking people. Well, it never tried to trick anybody. You see, nothing is stated in verses 2 and 3 that's inaccurate or that's untrue. Nothing is stated that's untrue. Now, if you want to just assume in reading that since we're talking about Persian kings in verse 2, we're talking about Persian kings in verse 3, that's okay, you're wrong, and the text never says that you're talking about the same kings down in verse 3. So it's an argument from a know-nothing individual who doesn't know what's going on. There's nothing untruthful at all here in this third verse. Whatever is stated is totally true. And if a person comes to the assumption that Persian kings are referred to, or a Persian king, a mighty king, then it's just that, an assumption that's not proven in Scripture, that's not implied here. Another thing we can say about this question, and therefore an argument for these chronological gaps, is that there's no need to give the intervening Persian kings because they're of no importance to Daniel's subject at hand. I think I've mentioned before what the view of some would be, that Daniel stated there were 4, and that's the best he could do. He didn't know that we have another half a dozen after that, Persian kings. But if you can state 4, you can probably state 5, and if you can state 5, you can state 6. I mean, if he stated 3, he could state 4, which he did. If he can state 4, then it's an argument from silence, as far as I'm concerned, for you to say that he couldn't state 5. You'd have to prove that. It's not here in the text. I mean, he did 4 better than you can do when you're prophesying world events years later. So that doesn't do much for our view of the people that come up with such notions as this. But you got to understand his purpose in drawing these verses together, and they are drawn together. That he has no need of mentioning the intervening Persian kings because they don't serve his purpose. The Persian kingdom, Daniel's point is, by the time it gets to this 4th and far richer than the all king, by the time it gets to this 4th king, then it's going to be a kingdom that continues to live after that. He doesn't imply, because we know from history that it's got another 144 years to go. But it's going to be a kingdom dead while it lives. And so why go into extra material that's not needed? And then finally, it's not as though there's no connection between the two verses. It's not as though we only have a twofold change from chronology and nationality and therefore no connection between the two. Because just the opposite is true here. A connection does exist. It's just a different one than we Western minds think of strict chronological order and strict pedigree. It's not that type of connection. And in every prophetic break in Scripture, no deception is intended, but you're going to find some type of real connection between the verses. Something's going to serve as a type, as a literal, physical, earthly type of maybe something that's a little more supernatural and dreadful and eschatological that is to come. And so you say, well, there's no connection because there are 2,500 years intervening in between the two. Well, one serves as the type of the other. I'm not saying that's true here. I'm just saying that happens in prophetic breaks in Scripture. Therefore, there is a very, very real connection. That's not the connection here. I've just said that Yavan is mentioned in concluding the verse. That Xerxes will stir up all of his military leaders to stir up their men under them. He will stir up all against the realm of Grecia, verse 3, and then a mighty king from Grecia is going to be stirred up, and he's going to stir up all of his realm against the realm of Persia. In other words, the idea, the theme here is attack and counterattack. That's the connection between the two verses, is attack and counterattack. Alexander, the mighty king, the Melech Gibor, is getting back at Xerxes and Persia for what they had done 150 years earlier, 150 years before his time. And as a matter of fact, in a letter of response to Darius III Codomanus, which was the Persian king when Alexander comes on the scene, Alexander even says that this is the very reason why he is attacking Persia. The very reason. He said, I'm attacking Persia because Xerxes, not Darius Hystaspes, because his attack wasn't as important as the attack of his son Xerxes. He said, the very reason I'm attacking you Persians and you Darius III is because one of your ancestors, Xerxes, attacked us. So that's the connection. He mentions the attack of Persia on Greece in verse 2, and the connection when we get to verse 3 is the counterattack of Greece upon Persia. And by Greece attacking Persia, then Greece routing the world as well. That part of the world anyway. Sometimes we say the then known world just because of then known people who made records that we still have today, but we know from creation that the then known world was the whole world. It was known. It was the whole world. People were living everywhere. We sometimes use that phrase, the then known world, speaking of Europe or Asia or the Middle East or something, because they were a little more enlightened and educated and civilized from what we have passed down to us and other people of their day, and that's why we have records of them and not of other people. So you see, Xerxes' attack here in a roundabout way has the effect years later of stirring up all of the realm of Grecia against Persia, which, if you'll remember from 2 weeks ago, was one of the ways that some people like Montgomery want to translate that phrase back up there in verse 2. Remember, we looked at the apposition versus the opposition. Is it stir up all Greece against, or stir up all against Greece? The hakol. And some people want to translate it this way, and we discussed several weeks ago that the stirring up has to refer to Xerxes' army. That's the grammar of verse 2. But in a roundabout way, by the time we get to Alexander's time in verse 3, as we see in his letter of response to Darius III, it really has the effect of stirring up all the realm of Grecia against Persia. But remember, that's not the translation, though, of verse 2. That's just the implication that we get in verse 3. Now, if you'll turn over to another verse I didn't give you, in Esther 1. We did conclude looking over in Esther. So we'll begin again looking over in Esther 1, that the hakol, since it's in the hiphel stem, has to, you see, hiphel in Hebrew always is causative. Someone is causing something else. If it's in hiphel stem, then Xerxes has to be causing that on his military leaders, inciting them to anger, hakol. He has to be inciting them to anger, and therefore to thoughts of conquering and defeat against all the realm of Greece. It's not in apposition as some people will make it out to be. And so he's stirring up his military leaders. We've given a lot of this to you before, but just to give you a verse that we looked at, but I'll give you a little better understanding. Chapter 1 of Esther and verse 3. Now, we're around 3 years, 2 or 3 or 4 years before the attempted invasion by Xerxes and the Persians of mainland Greece. So it's around 483 BC. And remember, through it's by his strength, through his riches, that he's stirring everything up. He's had all of this wealth passed down to him from Xerxes, I'm speaking of, from his ancestors, the kings of Medo-Persia that came before him, and now it's through the riches that he's able to equip his army and navy, and he stirs up the leaders to incite the men for everyone to join together and to attack Greece. Now, why make such a big thing of this? Because Daniel is stating it in prophecy. Remember, Daniel comes before the book of Esther. Daniel's stating this in prophecy, what's going to happen. And the extant secular records prove that this very thing happened, but for us, for our purposes, the Bible proves that this is exactly what happens. He's giving us the frame of mind of Xerxes and what he does and how he does it to make all these preparations for the attack upon Greece. And so verse 3, the 3rd year of his reign, he made a feast unto all his princes and his servants, the power of Persia and Media. Now, what the word power means, and I think some of your newer versions, like maybe NASB and maybe NIV, will give for that word power military commanders. Well, that's what the power of Persia and Media would be, military commanders. These are his princes and his servants. He's not throwing a feast for slaves that dust off the armchairs on the throne or something. The arms on the chair of the throne, he's not doing something like that. The servants, the princes, would be leaders. So he's throwing this feast for military commanders and leaders of Persia and Media, nobles, princes of the provinces being before him. And this, remember, is when they lay the groundwork for their attack upon mainland Greece. Okay, with all that said, I guess that just kind of introduces the verse. We'll get into some translation of the terms then. Great. Now, Leopold translates the phrase Melech Gibor, the mighty king, or in the Hebrew order, the king mighty, as hero king. And Keel gives this same translation, hero king, after he gives brave king, which is what I think Calvin gives. Calvin gives brave king. And that's the first guess of Keel as well. But he gives hero king, and other people have adopted since Keel, and I guess maybe Leopold, since he didn't take it as a second one, but as the first one as being the translation. I don't think that's a good translation of Melech Gibor, because the term Gibor comes from the verb gavar. Now, sometimes we give you transliteration, sometimes translation. Maybe translation is the best, since not everyone knows all of our symbols that we use around here. But you can tell whether it's translation or transliteration. So I'll translate it, G long A, V short A, R. Gavar. It comes from the verb. Gibor, the noun, comes from the verb gavar, which means to be mighty or to be great. And it appears 156 times in the Hebrew Old Testament. The RSV many times translates it as warrior, which I don't think is the best translation, but it's okay, because it does have physical and sometimes military connotations. To be mighty, to be strong, it has to be speaking of someone's physical strength and many times military power and strength. Although it could be just personal physical or personal mental strength. To be mighty or to be great. Warrior's not the best, but I guess it's better than Leopold and Keel's hero king. Now you're familiar, or you should be familiar, or at least it's gone through the airwaves once or twice before, and whether it went through your skull and didn't stay in there is something that remains to be seen, but it's gone through the airwaves back in Genesis chapter 6 and verse 4 that we've discussed the same term before in our studies in creation. It's a noun and it's plural here, but it still comes from the same verb as gavar. So you should be familiar with this from Genesis 6 and verse 4. Now remember, Genesis 6, 1-4 is that interesting passage that we can hardly get very many people to agree with us on our interpretation of the passage. Even a lot of the non-charismatic scholars today. Every time it seems like I come across this passage in someone's writings, they're always going for the old demon theory, the old demon view. Even when non-charismatic evangelical fundamental scholars hardly believe in demons and the supernatural, I don't know why they'd jump for that belief here. You know, you've got to believe that in Jesus' ministry, that you've got demons there, that were talking demons, and were real demons, but, you know, if you don't have to admit to that, I wouldn't admit to that if you don't believe it. And you don't have to admit to that in Genesis 6, 1-4, but some people do anyway. You know, the sons of God, the daughters of men. Well, anyway, without going into all of that again, because it's on tape, verse 4, there were giants in the earth in those days. Never says that demons produced these giants. It never says that the sons of God and the daughters of men produced these giants. It says in the same days when the sons of God came to the daughters of men, there were already giants in the earth. And also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men. The giants came before the sons of God mingling with the daughters of men. I mean, it's just so plain that it's ridiculous.
That's right.
In unto the daughters of men, they bear children to them. Okay, now we're talking about the children that they bore. Now, they weren't the giants. That's another group. The Hebrew's a different term. I think it's Nephilim here. It's seen over in Numbers 13:33. But be that as it may, they weren't produced in the union of sons of God, daughters of men. But this second group was produced. They bare children to them, the same became mighty men. Well, remember what we're talking about? A mighty king shall stand up. Mighty men, which were of old men of renown. Well, it's just the plural of the Gibor over in Daniel 11:3. The Giborim. Mighty men, strong men. Remember, the verb means to be mighty or to be great. It doesn't mean to be a giant in one's physical stature, but to be mighty in your strength. Some people will translate that tyrant there. They were mighty men in that they ruled over other men. And that could be an implication of what's said, but that's not what the word means, though. It's also used, just to give you some usages of the term, to help us better translate it. Whether hero king or brave king. I mean, that's Leopold and Keel and Calvin for you. But in Isaiah, in one of his prophecies of Christ, the son and child prophecy, Isaiah 9 and verse 6. Unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given. And everyone recognizes this to be a messianic prophecy. The government shall be upon his shoulder. His name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, Gibor El, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. So the same term is used in the messianic prophecy of Christ, Gibor El, the Mighty God. Now, I don't think the hero God is going to be a good translation here, you see. And I don't think the brave God is a good one. It's expressing his might and his strength. So mighty, or the strong God. You could translate it that way. The strong God. The everlasting Father, which is a very, very incorrect translation, but we won't get into that. And the Prince of Peace, which is okay. So I think we better stay with King James translation. Here we stay with King James, and not some of the other versions that give us various things, but a mighty king, not a hero, not a brave one, not a tyrant, but a mighty one. It expresses might, it expresses greatness, it expresses strength. A mighty king, Melech. That's translated M-E-L-E-K, just like it sounds, Melech. It's a very basic word, appearing over 2,500 times in the Old Testament. That can mean leader or chief or ruler or king. In other words, if you know the individual not to have been a king, then don't translate it king. But we know Alexander to have been a king. He was king in Macedon, the Greek king from Macedon. If he's just a leader, we had translated mighty leader, mighty ruler, mighty chief. But he's a king. Now this word, Melech, is found in almost all of the Semitic languages. Remember that they're carryovers because they're part of the same family of languages, the Semitic or Shemitic family of languages. And this is found in almost all of the Semitic languages. Genesis 14 proves that it's a very early term. Melech appears back in Genesis 14, which is way back 2000 BC. So for it to be found in all of the Semitic languages, it would probably have to be an early word, is what I'm saying, and Genesis 14 seems to bear that out. Then if you'll turn over to the New Testament, we'll look at a little commentary on that Genesis 14 passage, where you're familiar again with the word in the title, Melchizedek. That's Hebrews 7, verses 1 and 2. Melchizedek. Now, can you see Melech in there? M-E-L, and then all we need is an E that's just dropped out. E-C-H, pronounced like a K, and there you've got it, M-E-L-E-K. or M-E-L-E hard C-H. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham in Genesis 14, returning from the slaughter of the kings, and blessed him, to whom also Abraham gave a tenth part of all, first being by interpretation. He's going to interpret now what his name means, King of Righteousness.
Amen.
Which is what his name is made up of, two Hebrew words that mean king and righteousness. And he said after that he's also King of Salem, which is King of Peace. But you don't get that from his name, though. You get that from other things. You get King of Righteousness from Melchizedek. Melchizedek. So, king. And he even has it in the right order, King of Righteousness, because the first part of the name is Melech, M-E-L-E-K. So thus far we've satisfied ourselves with the King James translation and a mighty king. It can mean warrior or ruler, leader, or these various other things, but since Alexander was a king, it's best to leave it as that. A mighty king shall stand up, the Ahmad. Now the Ahmad, we've already covered before. Take as our subject now. A mighty king shall stand up. He shall come to regal and for Alexander, both at the same time, to regal and to military power. And then he gives a twofold description of him, that shall rule with great dominion, and that shall do according to his will. That shall rule with great dominion. Mashal meh mashal rav. Now, Montgomery and Cook say that the alliteration of verse 5 should probably be kept here in this verse, in this phrase, 11:3b, and therefore it would read, ruling with a great rule. The mighty king shall stand up, ruling with a great rule. Now, do you know what alliteration is? Alliteration is when you begin two parts. For our consideration right now, it can mean other things than this, but when you begin two parts of a verse that are separated from one another with the same word or the same letters, to initiate the word, so you have some connection there. Ruling with a great rule. You've got the basic word rule in there twice. Ruling with a great rule. Well, look down in verse 5. The end of this verse. And his dominion shall be a great dominion. You get the two words in there and you have alliteration. So it's been suggested by Montgomery and Cook and others that there's alliteration in verse 3 like we have in the English in verse 5, and therefore it should read in verse 3b in the English, that shall rule with a great rule. Now you say, well, rule, dominion, same thing. Well, then why translate it differently then? Why have rule there and then dominion? And we get down to verse 5, and you've got dominion there 3 times. Dominion, he'll have dominion, and his dominion will be a great dominion. Well, besides sounding a little stilted in verse 3, ruling with a great rule, 2 different words are used in the Hebrew. So alliteration is not necessary, and it's impossible. You've got 2 different words that appear. Now, to be sure, they're both derived from the same root, but since they're 2 different words, obviously we cannot translate them the same way. The first word, that shall rule, then with a great dominion, and they say with a great rule, that shall rule is simply mashal. M long A, S H short A, L. Mashal. which means to rule. It appears 80 times. It appears 80 times in the Old Testament. See, we're on this middle phrase, mashal. There's the word mashal. Meshal. Rav. Forget about the on the front of mashal. We're just concerned about the verb right now, not its prefix. And then for the second phrase, great dominion, it's the word meshal, which shows that it has a prefix attached to it, which is different, totally different. It means something different than the prefix that really doesn't concern us. It's attached to the first time that mashal appears. And anyway, the length of the verbs, or the length of the vowels, is changed by the time we get to the second word, which proves a lot. Meshal, M-I, short I. M-I-M, then what we call in Hebrew shva. We haven't gotten to that yet in our teachings in Hebrew to you, but we'll be there before too long. Or shva, which is a raised small sigol, which is a raised small e. It's a small e. Small e, short e, that's raised. You have to raise it so you know it's a shva and not a sigol. But M-I-M-E-S-H-A, long A now, L. Whereas before it was the one that was connected with sheen was a short A. Meshal. Now that's a derivative of the above word, but this word means dominion. It means dominion. And I'm sure we'll be seeing this later in the chapter. Now, what type of dominion do you think he's talking about here? A mighty king shall stand up that shall rule with great dominion. I guess the first assumption would be that he has reference to geographical control, geographical dominion, because we know how broad Alexander's kingdom was. Now what you're seeing up in front of you is a map of the Persian Empire, but the Greek Empire is simply the same. It just goes a little further west so it can include Greece. Now look how huge that is. We've discussed the realm of these empires. They always seem like they're getting larger and larger, from Assyria's little empire to Babylon's to Medo-Persia, which is this map, the Persian Empire. Now, Greece doesn't lose out any in Egypt. It doesn't lose out in the Middle East. It certainly doesn't lose out way over toward the east. Alexander took his trips all the way to the Indus River, which is right there. You even have it mentioned there, the Indus River, which is way over in Pakistan, way over in India, which is that's about the extent of not just the Persian Empire, but the extent of Alexander's empire as well. Remember, according to Esther 1:1, there were these 127 provinces that Ahasuerus ruled over from India all the way to Kush. Remember, that was a geographical explanation of his empire, from India, which is over here, all the way to Kush, which is over here in Africa. But you see, Alexander's empire takes all of Greece as well. This shows a little bit of Greece because they did have a little bit of control of Greece. They even had Persian emissaries right in the Athenian assembly and with the elders of Thebes and Sparta. They were spies, double agents is what they were. They had those there. But the extent is not as great as Alexander's empire. Well, the verse said that he shall rule with great dominion. That's fairly great dominion. But I don't think that the reference here is to geographical dominion, but to personal dominion and to personal authority. By that we mean Alexander himself, the personal sway that Alexander had over his troops. Remember, this is Daniel's prophecy of what's going to come, of what's going to happen in the future. Now we know that the empire was great in geographical extent. But the only reason the empire became great in geographical extent was because of the greatness of the personality of Alexander the Great himself. He's called Alexander the what? The Gibor. He's great. He's mighty. That's his very name down to this day. Alexander the Great. Now there are other people that have been referred to in history since then by a name like that, but everybody knows him not just as plain Alex, but Alexander the Great. And it's because of his personal authority, his personal dominion. If you think Xerxes, this is what the verse is saying, Xerxes had sway over his troops to incite them to anger against the realm of Greece. Wait until the king of Greece, this Malachi Gibor, comes on the scene, and he'll be twice as good, twice as powerful, hold twice as great a sway over his men as did Xerxes. We know from history that Alexander, his men followed him all over the world. Xerxes went and attacked Greece and went back home and had fun. But Alexander's men, for years, they didn't have a base in Greece and then go out and strike and then go back home. They were away from home for over a decade, just traveling the world fighting. Now, you have to have some control of a group of men to have them leave homes and families and everything to come and follow you all over the world. The only time they bucked him was when he said, let's go all the way through Japan and go over to North America. We'll discover North America. They said, this is too far. India is as far as we're going to go. And they stopped, and he stopped whenever they got that far. But they were gone over a decade, traveling all over the world, conquering things. He had great, great personal charisma and dominion. This is the great dominion. What I believe he means here, that he shall rule with great dominion over the men that followed him. So, mashal, mashal. Now, mashal also is a Hebrew term for something else. Not just the consonants either. You see, it's a 3-root consonant word here. Mem, Shin, and Lamed. But even when you add in the same vowels, long A, short A, it's the Hebrew term for proverb. Mashal. Mashalim Sefer is the book of Proverbs in Hebrew. Mashalim Sefer. But you can tell right away when you come across the word reading in the Hebrew Old Testament, mashal, now what's it going to mean? Is it going to mean rule, or does it mean proverb here? So you can tell without looking up in a dictionary what should it mean, because you look it up and it can mean both of those. It can mean rule and it can mean proverb as well. It's the very name for the book of Proverbs, Mashalim Sefer. Okay, that leaves us only one other small word here in this phrase. And that is the little adjective, Rav. R, short A, V. Or you would know it transliterated as R-A-B line. But see, some people don't know B line. So we'll just spell it for you so you know how to pronounce it. If you saw R-A-B and you didn't know what B line meant, you'd say Rab. R-A-B instead of Rav. It's a common Hebrew adjective that means much, many, or great. He shall rule with dominion, mashal, mashal. But what kind of dominion? Rav. Great dominion, which is a common Hebrew adjective and which is, in my opinion, translated correctly here. It appears 420 times in the Hebrew Old Testament, and of these occurrences, about 130 are translated in the KJV as great. Others, obviously, as much or many. So we're through with the second part of the verse. Probably, summing up now what we've said, we give you an explanation of what we've said after a study of the grammar. Probably what we have here is Alexander's personal sovereignty over his men and not the geographical extent of his empire. I believe this is better in line with what the prophet intends for us to understand, because he's going to expand upon that in the conclusion to the verse. But the personal authority and sovereignty and the tremendous charisma, using it in, of course, the worldly sense that Alexander the Great had. He had to have that to get men to follow him all over the place. Now, dominion, he shall rule with great dominion. We're not going to give it, he shall rule with a great rule. He shall rule with great dominion. Dominion also appears back in chapter 7 and verse 6 as a description of Alexander the Great. We couldn't really say so much of his empire, but of him. Daniel 7 and verse 6. After this I beheld, and lo, another what? Well, another beast, another creature, like a leopard, which had upon the back of it 4 wings of a fowl. The beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given unto it. The beast representing Alexander the Great, and then his empire as it's personified in him, the leopard. And dominion was given unto it. We just read Daniel 11:3 that he shall rule with a great dominion. However, the word for dominion in Daniel 7 and verse 6 is not the same word as the word we have over in chapter 11 and verse 3. You see, superficially, you'd run along and say, well, we've got it connected. Both had dominion, so it has to be the same thing. We have a different word. Why? Why do we have a different word in Daniel 7:6? Because it's written in Aramaic. Remember the middle section of the book, 2:4b through 7:28. It's written in Aramaic. See, I was telling you something you already knew, so you could guess that. Why is it a different word? It's different language. It couldn't be the same word. It's in Aramaic there. But we can just say this, the Aramaic word means essentially the same. So it's properly translated as well as dominion. Okay, leaves us with the final part of the verse, and do according to his will. And do according to his will. Ve'asa kiretsono. Ve'asa kiretsono. That's V-E, long A, S, long A, H. Ve'asa. Kiretzano, K-I-R, then a shva, then O-N-O. Now, I don't know if you've got your Hebrew Bibles or not, but even when you have them, it's good to go ahead and be writing. You can be reading along and see it there. Well, I don't need to write that. It's written for me. Well, it gives you practice, though, and you'll have it in your notes. Because sometimes you might have your notes and not your Hebrew Bible along with you. And do according to his will is the way it's been translated. Ve'asa kiretzono. Well, even it's pointed out by some of the commentators, even secular histories of Alexander the Great, such as the History of Alexander by Quintus Curtius. In chapter 10, verses 5 and 35, I'm going to give you a quote from that. They state almost the identical same thing, that Alexander the Great did according to his own will. In Quintus Curtius' History of Alexander, chapter 10, we read, by the aid, he's looking back. He's looking back past tense. Daniel's looking forward, future tense, remember. By the aid of his good fortune, he seemed to the nations to do whatsoever he pleased. To do whatsoever he pleased. And what he means by that is that he's done whatsoever he pleased. He's done that in a fashion as has no one else before him. He seemed to have the will to accomplish anything that he desired, which is unlike humanity. We just get stuck every now and then. but not for Alexander. So what it means is that Alexander was irresistible. And history proves this out as well as the scriptures. In his feats, in his talks, in everything that he did, he seemed to be irresistible. He didn't really listen much to others. He did what his own will was about the matter. And that basically was because he was so much brighter than his military advisors anyway. I mean, every king and conqueror has military advisors that go along with him. But Alexander didn't do according to what they said. Like, remember, sometimes the other kings they'd call on their soothsayers and magicians to prophesy what the future held, and then we'll do what you say to do. Alexander didn't call on anybody to tell him what to do. He was so much ahead, so much brighter than his military advisors, that he did according to his own will. He did whatever he wanted to do. And whatever he wanted to do, as far as the fulfillment of just physical strengths and military exploits, whatever he wanted to do was right and successful because he always accomplished it. So he's irresistible, and he does according to his own pleasure. And do according to his will. Do comes from the verb asa. A-S-A-H, two long A's. Remember creation studies. Asa and bara. People want to make a big distinction. One means, to make out of matter that's existent, and then the other means to create. And so if you ever confuse the terms, and you're confusing your doctrine, which we've taught a lot about asa and bara before. But to spell it for you, you have to start it with an ayin. So you'll see. You've always spelled it A-S-A, because that's just the way we would spell it in English, really, A-S-A. You drop the H because it's silent. But so you can see it spelled. It would be ayin, then long A, then sin, not samich, then long A, then hey. Now, you never knew years ago you'd be spelling asa as it should be spelled. And now you see how. It's a basic word for do or make. Just a basic verb in Hebrew that means to do or to make. And here, of course, it doesn't mean to make, it means to do. He shall make according to his will. No, he shall do according to his will. And then according to his will. This phrase that's stated in the long word, keretzano, comes from a word that appears 50 times in the Old Testament. Ratzon, that means pleasure in the sense of one's will or desire. Pleasure in the sense of one's will or desire. So we throw the word pleasure in. That's exactly what Quintus Curtius said of Alexander. By the aid of his good fortune, he seemed to the nations to do whatsoever he willed. No, Curtius said whatsoever he pleased. Well, you do what you please. That is your will, to do what is your pleasure. So it shows that it was not just the will of Alexander, but it was his pleasure to conquer the world. And the reason we're being so specific in all of these words is because we know so much about the history of Alexander that it's very interesting and very reassuring to go back to the scriptures that were prophesied long before he was born and see they specified these very things. If we didn't know a lot about Alexander, these words would still be true, that he did according to his will, and that he was a mighty king, and that he ruled with, irresistible power, and that he held great charisma and sway and authority and sovereignty over his followers, and we'd say, that's all fine and well for us, but because we know from history how these very things were true and characteristic of him, it's interesting to see it prophesied in Scripture ahead of time. So, summing up everything, in conclusion, we've got the following. The first place, this king's going to be mighty. The second place, he rules with personal sovereignty over his men and over anyone and everyone that he came into contact with. And thirdly, that he irresistibly performed his own pleasure. Now that, to a T, describes Alexander, the spoiled boy raised on Aristotle. Because, remember, he dies with a fever and a drunken fit in Babylon. He didn't know enough when to put a period to being so irresistible. Proverbs says wine can even control the strongest man if you don't resist it. So, in conclusion, let me give you a few chronological remarks. Verse 2, just to keep the scene vivid before you, verse 2 covers the period from 536 to 480 BC, or a period of 56 years. From Cambyses down to the reign of Xerxes, not the beginning of his reign, but down to the year of his attack upon mainland Greece. 536 to 480, or 56 years. Then in between verses 2 and 3, we have a 144-year gap. And then in verse 3, we have 13 years between 336 and 323 BC. 336, 323. So in other words, all of the things that were accomplished by Alexander, the battle at the river Granicus and Issus, and all the things that were accomplished by Alexander that we've already studied earlier, his various battles and travels and so forth, all of that fit neatly right here at this point, Daniel 11:3. Not before, not after. All of this fits neatly right into verse 3. A 13-year period, 336 to 323. Now you may want to take note, begin taking note, starting this evening, of your chart. For your chart between the Testaments, the history between the Testaments, provides the parallel between the history of events and references in Daniel 11. I don't know if all of you have noticed this before, but if you look under 330 BC and find Alexander the Great's name, what verse do you have under that? Daniel 11:3. Well, we picked these charts out years ago because they're right, not because they're wrong. We picked them out because they're right. So it's no surprise to find them right about Daniel 11:3. And then you see Daniel 11:4, and you see Daniel 11:5. You got to skip way on down there, way down to 250 to find Daniel 11:6. And then right beside that, Daniel 11:7 to 8, Daniel 11:9, Daniel 11:10, 11 through 12. Right on down to 170 BC, and you get Daniel 11:21 through 35. And I believe that will stop their references to Daniel. So take note of that, and this is correct, as I said, or we never would have chosen these charts if they aren't for the most part correct, and this certainly is. You can follow along right where we're headed, what time periods we're going to be talking about. It's just that we can give you a lot better explanation in teaching than what you see just with a verse stuck under someone's name of how there is a relationship between the two.